From Ally to Action, Preparing to Use Privilege for Social Justice Action. Hello, I'm Amy Eshelman, a professor in the psychology department at Wagner College, and I'm looking forward to talking to you today about moving from being an ally into taking action for greater social justice around racial discrimination. I want to start by exploring a few examples of my personal experience of white privilege at Wagner College. I was inspired to do this by thinking about the work of Peggy McIntosh, who in the 1980s wrote a seminal piece thinking about her own white privilege. She came to her awareness of her own white privilege by first being aware of how she was disadvantaged as a woman. So from her feminist perspective, as a woman, she came into an understanding of her own white privilege by starting to make comparisons. And so I want to start off by thinking about a few of the ways I've come to realize I have unearned advantages on Wagner College's campus. And it's uncomfortable to think about an unearned advantage. These are things, as McIntosh described, that I carry around with me weightlessly and invisibly everywhere I go. So McIntosh described it like being a backpack that has no weight and is completely invisible. And she can just rely on her white privilege to be with her everywhere she goes. So thinking about this, one thing I realized is that there's an assumption when I'm engaged in a conversation about race that I am more objective and less biased than a person of color might be in the same conversation. And that's unfair, but it's something that I just carry with me into every conversation about race that I have. I also never have to feel like my responses to a dialogue will represent my entire race. So there is this privilege that I carry with me that there's no assumption that I'm representing my entire race, but a person who might be solo or in a small group or just in general, a person of color might sometimes feel as though what they're saying carries the weight and the burden of feeling like they have to be a representative of their race. And then if I become emotional in a conversation, if I get heated and I raise my voice or I break into tears because I'm upset about something, I never have to think about it reflecting badly on my race. It's just me as an individual, and I don't have that extra burden about thinking about how will people perceive my race because of my actions. So these are just a few of my personal experiences of white privilege that I've become aware of. And one of the things we'll talk about today is that it's very hard to develop an awareness of our own privilege, and it's equally hard to have an awareness about our own biases. But I wanted to start with this because it might start to help people in the audience to think about privilege more broadly. So the next thing I want to do is talk about potential allies. And so these are people who might become allies but haven't yet become allies. And I'll define what I think that group entails. Then next we'll talk about current allies. And then finally, we're going to talk about a few ideas for action to move from being an ally into being active. But I thought it might be helpful for us to think about, well, who are potential allies? These are people that we might try to develop into being allies. And so potential allies are people who want people to be treated fairly. And they are not aware of systemic discrimination. So potential allies might say, I just treat people the way I want to be treated, and I think that that will fix what's wrong with the problem. But I just recently saw a quote where someone said, if someone thinks that individual behavior is going to be the solution to systemic discrimination, they're not understanding what systemic means. So, with a potential ally, this is someone who really means well. They don't want to increase the problem of discrimination in the United States, but their lack of awareness of discrimination means that they're not taking action to address systemic discrimination, and therefore they are just kind of going with the flow. And Beverly Daniel Tatum, who wrote Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria and Other Conversations About Race, Tatum argued that the way racism works in the United States is like one of those people movers at an airport, where if we just stand still, if we're passive, we move with the flow of that conveyor belt for people. And so she argued that there's a small portion of people who are actively racist, who are walking along and moving quickly in that direction. And then many people are passive, and to be passive is to support the system of racism and discrimination in the United States. And so to be anti-racist, a person has to make the effort to turn around and walk against the force of that conveyor belt. So, in order to help people move from being potential allies into allies, an awareness of systemic discrimination will be incredibly important. And so what are some of the ways that systemic discrimination happen today? So I'm just going to point out a few. So one of them is the evidence that we see of predatory lending practices. And so in 1964, the practice of redlining, of making legal segregation of neighborhoods, was outlawed. But we see that in the decades since then, and really quite recently, there have been a number of examples of predatory lending. So here's just a couple New York Times articles. I'll be happy if anyone reaches out to me to provide these links to anyone who requests them. And so here are a couple of New York Times articles that explore this predatory lending that has happened. Another example of systemic racism that's happening is we see biases in school discipline. So for very similar infractions of school rules, we see that Black students will be treated differently than white students, and Black students will be given harsher punishments. So some people have referred to this as the school to prison pipeline of starting to treat Black individuals as though they are criminals from the time that they're in school, and how this can systematically influence the entire racial group. Another example is bias in educational tests. So here are a couple of sources to support that. So one is a Washington Post article. The other is from Inside Higher Education. And so we see that tests that are used for admissions and such as the SAT, will systematically bias against certain groups, in particular, Black Americans. And so we have this evidence of systems such as creating tests that are unfair. And then the last one that I want to look at really quickly, and this is just a really quick list of some of the evidence of systemic racism that's happening, is we see that the responses to recreational drug use are drastically different. And so, how do we respond to Black Americans who might have used drugs at different points in time? So, how might a Black American heroin user be treated differently than a white American user of heroin? And so, one of these articles points out that because Black Americans are often prescribed less pain medication in general, their has been a lower rate of opioid use among Black Americans, and that's actually, so the article makes this argument that that's actually one time in which systemic racism has, in this odd way, benefited Black Americans by just having less access to prescription painkillers that are highly addictive. But then we see a few years back, drastically different penalties for crack cocaine compared to powder cocaine being primarily a drug used by white people. And so there's just this evidence of really responding differently, right? And rather than seeing, should someone be treated or should someone be sent to prison, is part of this. And so here are just a few examples that can be helpful to talk to potential allies about, so that they can start to see that it's not just about treating people the way they would want to be treated, but it is about really focusing in on helping them to understand that there is a system of racism in the United States, and to be an ally, we should be aware of that. So who are allies is the next thing that I want to look at. So allies have an awareness of systemic discrimination, and allies recognize that being passive supports systems of discrimination. So allies are aware of, I use this metaphor and I'll bring it up again, this conveyor belt that's moving people in the airport. They're aware that if they do nothing, if they're passive, they're actually supporting the system of discrimination in the United States. Allies have a commitment to working on developing awareness of their own privilege. And I am very committed myself to having an awareness of my own privilege, yet I regularly find myself, someone might point out a way that I'm privileged that I hadn't been aware of, and I try to really hear someone and listen when that happens. It's often a little embarrassing for me to have someone point out a privilege that I wasn't aware of, because I have this commitment to being aware of my privilege. It feels a little uncomfortable to realize, oh, this is easier for me than it is for other people because of no effort of my own. This is an unfair advantage that I did nothing to earn. But allies will be working on awareness of their own privilege. And that's going to mean that we're going to have to be humble. We're going to have to be open to people pointing it out. Allies are also working on awareness of their own biases. And we tend to have blind spots to our own biases. We're just not aware of where our biases lie. And so this is another thing that's very challenging for allies to do. We have to have an openness to having someone else point out ways that we're biased. And I don't want to be biased. It makes me really uncomfortable when I come to an awareness that I have been biased, but I have this commitment. I tell myself to sit with it, to acknowledge it, to apologize if my bias has potentially done harm to someone, and to realize that I am human, I have biases, and I need to work with those. Allies are working to understand the harm that's caused by systemic discrimination. And there's so much of it in this country that it is ongoing work to try to be aware of all of the ways that systemic discrimination have been harmful. Allies have anti-racist values. So not just values of wanting to treat people the way they'd like to be treated, but to have values that go against racism. And that's going to require this ongoing evaluation, identification of racism, and then really naming that racism. And allies will listen with empathy to the perspectives and the experiences of people who face discrimination. And this listening, really being a good listener, is a challenging skill for many of us. I know that I have a tendency to want to jump in and tell a story, or to jump in and tell someone how much I care. And so just sitting back and being quiet and keeping open. And there are definitely times that it might make me really uncomfortable to hear someone else's experience of discrimination. And I might want to shut that down. I might be tempted to try to explain it away or make it seem like, oh, I think you misunderstood. I don't think that the person meant that. But to be an ally is to learn to really listen and to take other people's perspectives seriously. So allies have anti-racist values. They're working on themselves. They are working on listening. But now, how do we go from ally to action? And so anti-racism requires action, not just having the right set of values, but acting on those values. And so this can mean having conversations with individuals with shared privilege identity. So I might talk to other white people about racism. So one of the things that I might do is try to talk to potential allies and move them toward being allies. Or I might try to talk to fellow allies and talk about how we might take action. And so having conversation with individuals, one very powerful example of this, Derek Black is the son of a white supremacist who started the Stormfront webpage. And when Derek Black was growing up, he had his own show on, he did a podcast where he talked about what white supremacy meant to him. He was a young white supremacist, and he went away to college, and his peers realized who he was. And one of his peers called out and said, we have an opportunity here to really interact with and maybe change his mind. And so one of the students started to invite him to a regular Shabbat dinner. And he was willing to go. He'd always liked people. So he was raised in a white supremacist family, but he'd always liked people in general. So he was the strangest of potential allies from the beginning. And he went and he listened, and the other peers would talk to him and they would ask him, and he thought he had cherry picked evidence. He had been raised in this belief system. And so he would share why he thought that white supremacist values were justifiable. And the students in this group would go away and look into his pieces of evidence and come back with stronger evidence, because white supremacy is not going to hold up to a critical analysis. And they would come back and they would show him the evidence, and they just dismantled the foundation on which he was trying to hold on to these white supremacist beliefs, just one dialogue at a time. And eventually there was no foundation left, and he realized he couldn't continue to support his white supremacy, and that it was gone. And in an interview I heard with him, he said, if I had just gone to my classes and heard my professors talk about systemic discrimination, I could have continued to convince myself, oh, they don't know what they're talking about. They're wrong. But it was this sustained conversation with his peers that he just couldn't continue to believe this wrong set of beliefs and to continue to misuse little tiny bits of evidence here and there that weren't consistent with the widespread evidence out there. And so that's a really dramatic example of someone changing their perspective. But how might we identify potential allies and talk with them or identify our common allies and talk about action that we might take? Another thing that we can think about doing is inviting individuals who face discrimination to work with us in different ways. And so we might think about working together on projects with peers. So thinking about who's on this project. I have this thing that I'm tackling in a class or for my work, and who's on my team, and how might I encourage more diversity on the team, different perspectives on the team, and also pull in someone who might be at a little bit of a disadvantage in some ways, but might actually really make the team much more enhanced by having a broader set of perspectives on the team. And then mentoring has been shown over and over again to be incredibly powerful. So thinking about thinking about your sphere of influence. What are things that you're strong at, and how might you become a mentor on those issues? And, so how might you work with someone who is at a stage of development of that skill a few years behind where you are? So, thinking about alumni, mentoring current students, thinking about juniors and seniors, mentoring first year students and sophomores. And then contacting legislators. So, really thinking about what are some issues that are critically important. We see with the dramatic legislative changes that are happening right now in New York around the George Floyd influence protests, and that now police past misconduct will be something that someone can look at if there's a new case. We see that chokeholds will be a felony offense, and so we see this dramatic change that's happening from protests, but also just reaching out to legislators and letting them know what it is that you're hoping to see to make changes in this system. This is a very incomplete list, but the last one I'm going to point out for this slide is an awareness of what sorts of organizations we're financially supporting. And so thinking about who is the owner, what groups they support. So when we're buying things, when we're investing money, to have an awareness of who we're choosing to financially support and whether or not those organizations are fighting against systemic discrimination. One of the ways that we can interact with people who have a shared privileged identity is to help them overcome potential resistance to an awareness of their own privilege. And I want to spend a little time talking about this because it's so common for people to not see the way that they're privileged, and it can be uncomfortable, as I said before, for people to become aware of their own privilege. So they might try to resist it. They might say, well, no, the way I get treated is just the way anybody should be treated. And so I don't see what the big deal is. But to help people to see that the way that they're treated is not the way other people are treated, and that they have this unearned advantage, can really help to open them up to being a better ally and taking more effective action. And so an awareness of one's own disadvantage can be a window into understanding privilege. And so we see that people tend to have an awareness of the ways that they're disadvantaged, and they tend not to see the ways that they're privileged. But if they take some time to think about their own experiences of disadvantage, that can be a way for them to then start to realize, okay, well, I'm disadvantaged in these ways, and then, oh, I'm also advantaged in these other ways. And so some ways to go into that might be to talk to them about, are they disadvantaged in any way in their role on campus? So, for example, students might feel as though they don't have the power that they wish that they had, that some other roles on campus might have. Age. Some people might feel too young to be taken seriously, or they might kind of wish they were a few years younger. So how we're treated in this society where there's sort of like this ideal age, and anyone younger or anyone older tends to have some disadvantages. Financial status. Most of us would probably love to be in the top 1%, right? And so for many of us, thinking about ways that we feel disadvantaged based on our finances could be a way into seeing privilege. And so by looking at, helping someone to just spend some time thinking about advantage and disadvantage, by seeing their own disadvantage could help them then to shift, right? So to have an awareness that disadvantage happens could help them to see, well, what are some ways that these other groups that you're concerned about are disadvantaged in comparison to you? And once we see that disadvantage, we can start to see that unearned advantage and label that as privilege. Ibram X. Kendi is a historian and a very powerful scholar, and I loved this quote. The only way to undo racism is to consistently identify and describe it, and then to dismantle it. And so Kendi argues that racism is an action. It's not who someone is. And so it's not something that we can just say, oh, okay, I'm not racist, and then be done with. It's ongoing action. And so to be anti-racist is going to take this consistent work to identify, describe what's happening. And then once we understand it, right, if we can describe it, we can understand how it works, and then think about how do we dismantle it. So I'd be happy to continue this discussion. This is just the start of a discussion that needs a lot of time, a lot of attention. So today is starting a discussion, and I will be more than happy to continue this discussion. Please feel welcome to reach out to me by email or stop me if you see me on campus. And I look forward to continuing this discussion with you.